Take your Bibles tonight, turn to Exodus chapter number 1. Exodus chapter number 1. We are moving on from Genesis to Exodus. And I was planning tonight on preaching the first 4 chapters of Exodus. I just need to plan on doing this for the rest of my life instead of the couple years, because it never works out if I try to preach multiple chapters. So we're going to look at 2 chapters tonight, Exodus chapter 1 and most of Exodus chapter 2. And I'm really excited about it because as I was studying this out, there are certain characters in this story that I think are great examples for us and speak to our times. And I wanted to spend some time on them and not rush through it. And so we're going to look at this. Let's get started by reading the first 7 verses of Exodus chapter 1. It says, "Now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, and all his brethren, and all that generation. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them." So we're kind of turning the page here from the stories in Genesis to stories in Exodus. And when we left off, the children of Israel were in Egypt already. Remember, Joseph brought them down there to save them from the famine, gave them the land of Goshen, and they were treated well under Joseph, right? I mean, there was a good deal for them. They even got to bring the carts up there and bring all their stuff. They were welcome guests. They were honored guests. And Exodus picks up right where Genesis leaves off. In fact, if you read Hebrew, I don't read Hebrew, so I'm taking somebody else's word on this, but if you read Hebrew, the very first word in Hebrew of the book of Exodus is the word "and," conjunction. And so this is a continuation of Genesis, and the first 6 words of verse 1 are actually word for word the same as promises in Genesis given to Jacob. And so this is definitely a continuation of the story. There's lots of little hints that are put in here to remind us that this is a continuation of the story. We're on to the next chapter here. There's a lot of time, though, that goes on between Exodus and Genesis. A lot of time between Joseph and Moses. In fact, the Bible tells us it's 430 years. So that's 430 years of captivity. That's a long time, right? I was thinking about this. 430 years ago, it was 1593. You know, Jamestown, Virginia was still 14 years away from becoming a thing. And so there's been a lot of water under the bridge in our country, in our land, in 430 years. And imagine, Jamestown started, I think, 110 men or something like that, and now we're a country of 300 million people. All of that happened in the last 430 years. And so something similar happened with the children of Israel. Remember, God had promised Abraham that his descendants were going to be like the sands of the sea, like the stars in the sky. And they come to Egypt, and it's just 70 souls. I was thinking about that. That's not even that much. My mom and her posse, there's 32 people in my mom and stepdad's family now. When we get together, if we can all get together, it'll probably never happen again, but if we do, 32 people. So Jacob has 12 kids, literally twice as many as my mom. You can see them getting to 70 pretty quickly. And when God brought them out of their captivity 430 years later here, there are at least 800,000 men, fighting-aged men. And add to that women and children, there could have easily been more than 2 million Israelites that were living in Egypt. And that would have made up, if you study Egypt at the time, that would have made up a large percentage of their population, right? Like, there would have been a Jewish person for every Egyptian person, if not even 1.5 Jewish people for every Egyptian person, okay? And that when you have a nation and it gets taken over like that, it's a problem, right? And so look at verse 8. It says, "Now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, and he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falleth out any war, they join also unto our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land." All right, so a couple things going on here. First, we know from history that there was a period of time when Egypt was ruled by outsiders. They were called the Hyksos dynasty. And they ruled for quite a while, right around the beginning of this time. And so most likely what happened was Joseph came to power underneath one of those Hyksos pharaohs. And the Hyksos people were actually from up near Canaan. They were genetically close relatives to the Jews. And so those people, those pharaohs get ousted, and the Egyptian people take back over. They take their country. You have Egyptian pharaohs again, and it would make sense that along with that revolution would come a new view on outsiders, right? So basically, this is like, Brexit or something going on here in Egypt. And the Jews, who had come in as this small family and just grown like crazy, now they're seen as a threat to these Egyptians. And so the Egyptian leaders make it a point of policy to do something about the Jews. And they kept them under control. They wanted to keep them from further multiplying and taking over the country. And so they come up with a plan. And that plan is going to get progressively worse. Verses 11 to 14. It says, "Therefore did they set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew, and they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor." So here was the plan of the Egyptians. The Egyptians' goal is to reduce the population of the Israelites and to keep the Israelites under control. And to do that, they wanted to reduce the amount of men, right? And the first plan that they had here was kind of a subtle plan, was they were going to force all of the men into enslavement, into hard labor. And the thought was if they could get the men away from the women, then they'll stop having as many babies. And that just makes sense, right? And so they made the men build these cities and these kind of military installations for them that were pretty close to where they lived in Goshen. But the plan didn't work. Somehow they ended up having even more babies. And the Egyptians, they were like, what are we going to do? Well, they're just not doing it hard enough, so they're going to turn it up a notch. And they set up taskmasters, and they just literally are just working these men to death. They made them make bricks. They made them work in the fields. They probably were forced, if you know anything about Egypt, it's like 7 miles, just a 7-mile strip in the desert along the Nile. So like 3 miles on either side is all the arable land that they have. They probably were forced to carry heavy jugs of water from the river to the farmland for irrigation. That's probably the majority of the work in the fields on top of their brick work. Okay? And it's just backbreaking, difficult work. And in theory, this should have solved the population problem. I mean, from their perspective, the men are away from their wives almost all day. It means there's less time and energy for them to give into their families. They're working hard all day, which means they can't look after their farms. They can't look after their flocks. Eventually, that would cause a starvation problem. And they wouldn't have been merciful to people that were weak in the fields. So if they're sick, they would have just kept working them, you know what happens when you keep working a sick animal? It just dies, right? And so they're literally trying to work them to death. That's the plan here. They're just desperate to get rid of them, but they want to get as much as they can out of them in the first place. By the way, obviously, this was evil, all right? We're not saying any of this was good, okay? Obviously, this is evil. The plan was they were trying to cut down the population of the Israelites, but it didn't work. And in fact, everything the Egyptians did to try to curb the population of God's people totally backfired, and somehow the Israelites kept having more and more babies. And so it was time for the Egyptians to try something a little bit more drastic. And that's what happens in verse 15 and 16. Look at these verses. It says, "And the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if he be a daughter, then she shall live." So Pharaoh talks to the midwives. By the way, there had to have been more than 2 midwives. We understand that. There's like millions of the Jews, so there had to be more than 2 of them. They were the lead midwives, is the idea here. Okay? But Pharaoh says, when you're doing your midwife thing and you're delivering babies, if it's a baby boy, then kill it. If it's a baby girl, then let her live. And it's not recorded for us, but I imagine Pharaoh said more than that. I imagine there was probably some kind of bribe involved and also an or else involved, right? A carrot and a stick. But look how the midwives responded. Verse 17, it says, "But the midwives feared God and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive." So these midwives are like, nope, I'm not going to do it. I am not killing these male babies. Why? Well, it tells us because they feared God. Okay? What that means is they feared the consequences of disobeying God more than they feared anything that would happen to them on this earth. And I imagine Pharaoh's consequences could have been pretty severe. But they feared God more than that, and they refused to kill these babies. Now, here's the thing. It would have taken them a long time. It would have taken the Egyptians a long time to figure out that they weren't doing this. Up until about 10 minutes ago, historically speaking, babies all dressed the same, boys and girls. How many ever go to Freddy's? It's been a while since I've been there, but I love Freddy's. And there's a picture on our favorite booth in Freddy's of Freddy. By the way, you know what would make that place better? More pictures of Freddy. That would be good. But there's a picture of Freddy as a baby in the 1920s. It's on the booth that we normally sit in. And he's wearing, it looks like a dress, like a little white dress. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. And I remember looking at it the first time. I was like, that is just bizarre. Why is this boy, it was like a war hero or something. Why is he wearing a little white dress? Okay? And the reason is all babies dressed like that up until very recently. And so, let's be honest. I'll say this. If I'm holding my baby and she's not wearing pink and somebody comes up, they don't know. You don't know. Maybe you white ladies are like, I know. No, you don't, okay? When the babies are babies, they all look the same. And so it would have taken a while before it was obvious that the male babies weren't being killed. And but eventually they figure this out, and Puah and Shiphrah are called into Pharaoh's throne room to give an account here. Verse 18, "And the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said unto them, Why have you done this thing and have saved the men children alive?" I love their answer. Verse 19, "The midwives said unto Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them." So basically, Shiphrah and Puah said, you know what, our mothers are, they're a little bit more active than your Egyptian mothers. And by the time we get there, they're already done, right? They're taking this on themselves. They're a lot more active than the Egyptian mothers. And I imagine what happened, okay, is that the midwives started doing their rounds and going to pregnant ladies and saying to them, listen, it is in your best interest to have the baby before I get there. Okay? Do everything you can. I'll show you what to do, you know. But I imagine they were late on purpose. And, you know, I don't think they would have killed the baby if they weren't. But I think there's some scheming going on here. And amazingly, Pharaoh's like, okay. Like, nothing is done to them. Like, I don't understand that. God had to be intervening there. But God rewarded these midwives. Look at verses 20 and 21. It says, therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses. So typically, midwives were childless women. These were women that couldn't have kids, but because of what these women did, God blessed them and opened their wombs, and the midwives were able to have their own children. That's what it means by it says they had houses. Okay? God gave them families of their own. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a minute, and we're going to talk some more about these ladies, but I want you to know something that's interesting. You know what's interesting in this chapter? Okay? Interesting in the book of Exodus in general. We don't know Pharaoh's name. Pharaoh is just called Pharaoh. That's a title. It's king. It's like president. We don't know his name. We don't know what Pharaoh this was. We aren't given any of the elders of Israel's names, any of the leaders of the houses of Israel's names. That's not important. We're not told that. Okay? But you know what we are told here in the first chapter? We're told the names of two midwives. Shiphrah and Puah. Why is that? You know, I was like, well, I gotta figure this out. Like, maybe there's something significant in their names. Often there's significance in Bible names. And so I looked it up, and Shiphrah means fair or pretty. And Puah, ironically, means fragrant. But you get the idea that these are just normal women names. There's nothing special about their names. So, why do we know their names? Here's the reason why we know their names. We know their names because they're heroes. That's why we know their names. Because they feared God, and they risked their life, and they stood up to the Egyptians, and they stood their necks out for others. They're heroes, and God wants us to remember their names. Okay? Anybody that says that the Bible doesn't honor women has never read the Bible. Like, it's just a foolish position to take, especially if you know anything about history. Okay? Because the way that the women of the Bible are treated, the way that they're that they're lifted up as these women are here, the way that Jesus treated the women around him, it's just ludicrous to say that. Okay, these women are heroes, and they're held up for us as heroes. Now, we're going to come back to that in a minute. Look at verse 22. So, it says, and Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So what's Pharaoh doing? Pharaoh's taking the gloves off. Pharaoh's like, well, the midwives aren't going to do it. Obviously, they're not going to do it to themselves, so we got to get involved here. And so instead, he tells his people, I don't know if that's all Egyptians or if he was speaking to like the police that were underneath him, I don't know. But he says, you are to be on the lookout for Hebrew women that have babies, and if it's a baby boy, when you see a baby boy, throw it into the Nile River. Kill it. Remember, Egypt is, like I said, is basically built around the Nile River. Everybody lived right next to the Nile River. And so they would have been using the river for garbage. That's how they would have got rid of their sewage, got rid of their garbage. It's also how they got their water. That sounds fun, okay? But they would have been using it for garbage. So he's basically saying, take those babies and treat them like rubbish and throw them away. Okay? And what follows is mass infanticide. It's mass baby killing. Now, let's look at chapter 2. We're going to move on. Verses 1 and 2. And there went a man of the house of Levi, and took to wife a daughter of Levi. And the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw him that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. Okay, let's be honest. He didn't have to be a goodly child. If he was an ugly child, she still would have hid him for 3 months. Right? Everybody's baby is beautiful to them. And basically what that's saying is she saw him and she's like, this is my baby. I'm not going to do this to my baby. And so she hides the baby for 3 months. And you know what? I don't think she was the only person doing stuff like this. I imagine that all of the Hebrews were doing their part to keep their babies alive. 2 of them here are named Amram, Jochebed. We know that from later, that's Moses' mother and father's name. And they have this little baby boy. And they love their little baby boy. And they're not about to throw their baby boy into the Nile. And so they hid the baby. And that's easy to do when a baby is a newborn. You know, newborn babies, for months, they just basically sleep, right? Like most of the time. They're pretty easy to keep quiet most of the time. You know, you can feed them if they're crying. You can rock them. But after a couple months, they're not easy to keep quiet most of the time. Okay? We moved Addie into another room, out of our room last night. I slept on the floor next to her bed, and she cried for at least 2 hours straight without stopping. I'm a heartless dad, aren't I? Okay. But, you know, you can't, it's not easy to keep babies quiet after a certain age. So what are they going to do? Well, they come up with this plan, verses 3 and 4. When she could not longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and put the child therein, and she laid it in the flags by the river's bank, and his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. So here's the plan. The Egyptians made everything out of bulrushes. We'd call it papyrus. And they probably already had a bulrush or a papyrus basket. And Jochebed, she took one of these baskets and she put some tar or some pitch around it, and she covered up that basket so that it would be watertight, and she put her little baby boy in the river. Okay? And here's what I think happened. I think they probably had some kind of warning system, right? Like they knew that the Egyptians came maybe a certain time of day, and maybe they knocked on their neighbors' doors to like hide the babies kind of thing. And I think they had that basket ready, and when they knew that the Egyptians were coming, they would take the baby and they would put him in the basket so that his life would be saved. And then Miriam, she's not old enough to go out and work yet, but she's got old enough to have some responsibility. She's out there watching to make sure nothing bad happens. It's a good plan. It's a good plan. But you know what? God had a better plan. And we see that in verse 5 and 6. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river, and her maidens walked along by the river's side. And when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So, into the Nile where the baby's floating comes this Egyptian princess. Listen, she was probably one of many Egyptian princesses. Back in those days, kings had harems, and with harems came lots and lots of children. Read about how many children David and Solomon had sometime. It's fair to assume that the pharaohs had just as many. Okay? But she's still a princess, and she goes down into the water, and she's there, and she's cleaning herself off, and she hears something in the bushes, and she says to her servants, "Hey, go check that out. What's going on with that? I hear that sound. Go find out what that is." And they go, and they get it, and they bring it to her, and it's a boy, a little baby boy. Now, she's not stupid. She knows it's a Hebrew boy. She understands why the boy's there and how it got there, okay? But her little heart, her maternal instinct kicks in, and her little heart is touched, and she hears the baby cry. And Miriam, who, by the way, Miriam gets like Oscars for this, okay? She's watching the whole thing. She springs into action. This is one bright 10-year-old. Listen to what she says, verse 7 and 8. Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call to thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. And the maid went and called the child's mother. So Miriam knows what's up. She's like, here's an opportunity. This lady is holding this baby, and she obviously has some affection for this baby. I'm going to see if we can go get somebody to feed the baby so it stops crying. Can I go take care of that for you? Of course, she knows this, that she's going to go to the baby's mother, her mother. And God worked it out that this little baby would get to be nursed by its own mother. It gets better. Look at verse 9. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, take this child away and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages. And the woman took the child and nursed it. So not only does the baby get nursed by its own mother and gets to be nursed in its own home, no more fear of it being killed. If the Egyptians come in, they're like, oh, this is a princess's baby right here. You better not touch that, right? No more fear of that. But get this, they get paid to take care of Moses. This is great. Verse 10, and the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she called his name Moses. And she said, because I drew him out of the water. So the baby eventually is taken to Pharaoh's daughter. It's weaned, and gives him the name Moses. Moses is the Egyptian word for son, like good job, son, like not sun in the sky. And but in Hebrew, it has it sounds like the word for draw out. And so God took Moses out. God has special plans for this baby boy. Now, isn't it interesting that in this first 2 chapters of Exodus, God used 5 different women to save Israel? You have the 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. You have Moses' mother, Jochebed, Moses' sister, Miriam, and then Pharaoh's daughter. So 5 women who save Israel. Now, I haven't made any application yet. I've already taken a lot of time to get to this point. But I do think there are some things that we can learn from these stories that apply to us today, and I want to make a couple points of application. Okay, you see, the kingdom of the world, and Egypt is a picture in the Bible of the kingdom of the world. The kingdom of the world wanted to destroy God's people. They went after their families. They went after the fathers. They went after the babies. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, between Egypt and the world that we live in. The reason why Egypt was the way it was because they didn't ever have to worry about agriculture. Because of the Nile and the way the Nile worked, their agriculture just was consistent as can be. And so they didn't have to worry about the things everybody else was able to worry about. They were able to advance very quickly as a culture. They were far more advanced than anybody else technologically, government, the sophistication of their government, the sophistication of their education. They were just an extremely advanced culture. There's some architecture stuff that they were able to do. We still haven't been able to figure out how they pulled it off. Like the Great Pyramid of Giza is completely level, like completely flat. How they did that without computers, that big of a building, it's marvelous. They were very intelligent, smart people. They were insulated from lots of the hardships of life, and as they were insulated, they grew in this world's riches. And that's one of the reasons that God consistently uses Egypt as a picture of the world and of worldliness. Because they just had a lot of this world's riches. They had a lot of power. Now, how did these 4 women, we're going to leave the princess alone, okay? Okay, she doesn't quite fit. But how did these 4 women fight back against this world system? Simple. They feared God. They feared God and they believed Him. And for them, listen, this is what that meant for them. For them, they listened to their God-given maternal instincts. They ignored the pressure of the world to not have children. They protected their babies from the world's wicked designs for them. and they taught their children about God. Do I need to say it? Okay? We are once again surrounded by a world that doesn't see us as a blessing, it sees us as a threat. Just like Israel found themselves in the middle of a world that at one time saw them as a blessing and then turned to see them as a threat, the world, once again, does not look at people like us, people that believe the Bible, and they're like, oh, great, more Christians moving into the neighborhood. Okay? And the world is once again in an anti-baby mood. We could talk about abortion and the millions killed by abortion, but I'm not even thinking about that. There's something called the replacement fertility rate. Has anybody ever heard of this? There's a minimum amount of babies that has to be born to keep society going. And that number is 2.1 babies per woman. In order for the world to keep going, there needs to be at least 2.1 babies. And for most of our history, we've been way past that as a country. Okay? Even up in 2007, the fertility rate in the U.S. was over 2.1. The last time they recorded it, we're down to 1.64. We are now well below the replacement fertility rate. We're in the same. We're headed to the same predicament that Europe is in, and Japan is in. Put it another way, in 2017, there were 681 million babies in the world. They're projecting that by 2100, there will only be 401 million babies. But we don't know that that's ever happened in history. I'll put it another way. In 2017, there were 141 million people over the age of 80. They're projecting that by 2100, there will be 866 million people over the age of 80. So there's going to be twice as many people in their 80s as there are small children. Think about what that means for retirement. Forget about retiring at 65. You'll be lucky if you can retire at 85. Okay? There's not going to be any young people left to take care of the older people. And there are already parts of the world where this is happening. In Japan, they're developing robots to take care of people in nursing homes because there's just no young people to replace the older generation because people stopped having kids. Okay? And I want you to understand, it's coming here. It's coming here. People just don't want to have babies anymore. They're not interested in it. Statistically, we're at the point now where there's more families with dogs than families with children. And by the way, I love dogs. Well, I don't love dogs. I love that people love dogs and have those companions, okay? I don't want to lie in the pulpit. I love dogs a lot more than cats, I'll say that. Amen. All right, but I love dogs. I love that dogs can be a companion to you. Dogs are not children. And it's a gross comparison. Please stop making it, okay? I'll give you one more statistic. They polled Americans that don't have kids that are childbearing age. So I think they said 19 to 49. And they asked them if they were going to have kids, if they thought they'd ever have kids. 44% of these parent-aged non-parents said that it's unlikely that they would ever have children. So I just want you to understand, our world is turned against Christians, and it's turned against the idea of families and children. You think about all the stuff that's getting pushed in the world, I don't want to get too political, but, in the elite's mind, we all need to live in the cities, and we all need to take public transportation, and we all need to or ride bikes around or drive electric cars. You know what doesn't work with any of that stuff? Having a big family, right? Like, they don't make an electric minivan yet. Like, try getting a family, my size family, groceries. I can't fit my groceries and my children in my Tahoe. Okay? Try doing that on public transportation. It just doesn't work. Okay? They're not interested in families. And what they see as a curse, God says is a blessing. Children, the Bible says, are an heritage of the Lord. Children are an inheritance. The fruit of the womb is his reward. Here in this chapter 1, it's obvious God is fulfilling the promises that he made to Abraham. God is blessing these people, but they see it as a curse. So here's the point I want to make, okay? One of the most radical things that we can do is the simplest thing, and that is just have as many kids as God will let you have and raise them for the Lord. Okay? Just have a bunch of kids and raise them for the Lord. Listen, I believe that mothers are on the front lines today of Satan's attacks. And here's what I think mothers can do to help save our country, help be effective witnesses in our world. I think they just need to embrace their role as mothers and raise their children for the Lord. Listen, let me tell you this. Stop listening to the world. Stop listening to what the world says about kids. They are not your friends. Okay? They are not your friends. They do not like you. They might say that they're looking out for your best interest when they put down mothering, okay? But they are lying to you. Do what Pua and Sapphira did when they got the world's instructions, all right? Throw it in the trash. Ignore it. Be like Jochebed. Be like Miriam. Do whatever you have to do to protect your children from this world's menace. I think, I'll get practical here, okay? I think it's best to educate your children, give your children a Christian education, okay? If you cannot do that, then read your children's textbooks, okay? Go to their school board meetings. Teenagers are really going to hate what I'm about to say, okay? Parents, if your kids have phones, you need to have absolute control over their cell phone. Everything that's on there. Okay? Get rid of TikTok. Get rid of Snapchat. Listen, I heard this week. It's not in my notes. 60% of teenagers said they would rather forever give up the right to vote than give up TikTok. What? That's why they don't vote. Just take control. We have, as the Lord has given us responsibility to bring up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The Lord has given us responsibility to look out for our children and make sure that our children are educated as He wants them to. So one of the best things that we can do is the simplest thing. Just have kids and do everything in your power to ensure that they're godly kids. Let me read one more verse here. Hebrews 11:23, referring to this, says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents because they saw that he was a proper child and were not afraid of the king's commandment." Satan is the king of this world, the prince of this world. And I believe that the devil is after our kids. I think he'd love nothing more, first, for us not to have kids, right? For people not to have kids, especially if they're Christians. So the first lie of the devil is just focus on yourself. You know, people more and more are replacing children's toys with grown-up toys. You go to the store these days. Man, I am meddling, and this is not in my notes. Okay? You go to the store these days, and there are huge sections in the stores for grown-up toys. Grown-up toys should not be a thing. Okay? All right? Grown-up bobblehead. I have a bobblehead of Spurgeon on my desk, but grown-up toys should not be a thing. All right? People replace family with career. It's a dead end. If you do have kids, I think that Satan wants the next thing he's going to try to do is turn your children into mindless little techno-zombies, right? That just walk around like this all day long. And I got kids, and my kids are I'm a super techie person, and my kids are all techie, and they have every techie thing you can think of. I know how hard this is to fight back against this thing, okay? They turn into little screen lemmings that are just getting the drip, 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 drip of worldliness nonstop all day long, all night long, just constant internet garbage, okay? We have to fight back against that. And I think if he can, he's going to fill our kids with their minds with all kinds of garbage that goes against what God's word says. Literally, Satan is attacking every single thing about creation that God calls good. You know, gender is not something that's man-made. God created gender all the way back in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. Male and female created he them. That is under absolute attack by the world today. Listen, that did not naturally turn into 20% or 20 times as popular as it was 10 years ago. Satan wants to fill our kids' minds with that garbage. And listen, if he can, our precious daughters, he'll fill their bodies with chemicals that will keep them from ever being women themselves. Who's going to stand in the gap? We have to, as Christian families, have to say, this is where the line ends. I'm going to stand in the gap. Mothers, you need to stand in the gap. Will you be a Jochebed that protects your baby? Maybe you can't have children. Maybe you've already had your children. Then can you be like the other characters in this story? Pua and Sapphira and Miriam, and do everything you can to support and to protect these other people that are raising their children for Christ. All right? Look, listen, I know this is super unpopular, but this stuff is a million times more important than being a girl boss or a wine aunt or aunt, as you all say, okay? A million times more important. You in your home are the front lines of this nonsense. Will you stand in the gap for Christ and be like these godly women? All right? Let's stand together and pray, and then I'll turn it over to Brother Adam. All right? Heavenly Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for the example of these women, the bravery of the women in this story that stood up against